The thing that attracted me to Millie Jackson's Remixed project is a couple of factors really. Number one, I have been a Millie Jackson fan for most of my life. I have very fond memories as being a young teenager. I guess I was about 13 or 14, buying her first records, and I really, really loved them. So when the opportunity came to mix it, for me as a record producer, it's like being an archaeologist, being able to uncover what really went on in the session. So I was very excited to be involved in it. The choice of tracks on this project was a really difficult one because fortunately all of the multi-tracks exist, and Ace Records very kindly supplied me with a Excel spreadsheet of everything that was available. So it was a combination of looking for the titles that I was very, very familiar with, but also some of the less familiar titles, because being a fan, I always thought there were one or two album tracks that maybe slipped through the net, excuse the pun. So on a remix project like this, and I think it's really important to distinguish that this is a remix as in paying homage to the original. It's not like a dance remix where I've just kept the vocal and added a brand new drum track and new bass lines. What I did was listen to the original in CD form. I'm familiar with most of the records anyway, but I think like many people, when you listen to them at the moment that you're starting a job, you analyze it in a slightly different way. So I listened to the original CDs of Millie's mixes for two reasons. Firstly, I wanted to check things like where they'd positioned some of the instruments, because on some of the older songs where the track count is less, where they perhaps only had 8 tracks, I wanted to see what their choices were, because they didn't have the ability to pan things like we do now. And secondly, just to have a look at the effects that were used, because fashion changes, and something that was very relevant in 1974 may be less relevant now. So that's why I checked them. But once I'd had a good listen to the original CDs, I didn't go back to them. So when you're presented with a project like this to do remixing, there's always that tough quandary of what do you do with the audio? So all the audio that's on the recordings is from the original multi-tracks. However, I have enhanced things here, there and everywhere, in the same way that many people that do these restoration projects do. I was very fortunate in that I was able to combine a couple of interesting, tasty things from one of the other tracks, and sometimes, because the multi-tracks were in their entirety, there might be a little isolated thing on the outtake that was able to be copied across to the master, and that was actually very valuable. It's something that isn't the case now, where most things that are recorded into a computer, you don't tend to keep the outtakes, whereas in those days the multi-track was left running, and if the musicians played for 30 or 40 seconds and then broke down, they go, okay, hang on, we'll start another take. That bit was still there, and there were a couple of instances where there might have been a bit of isolated drum or isolated kick drum, and I was able to use that to enhance what was there on the master take. I've tried to be as respectful as possible to the original production. That's absolutely, this is producer respecting another producer's work. The original producers and Millie herself, they did a fantastic job on those multi-tracks. But there were one or two songs that, in exposing some really quite intricate little parts, so for example, on a couple of the tracks, when I was soloing some of the instruments, I was hearing strings and brass parts that I'd not really noticed in the same way. Or, for example, there were some very interesting little piano motifs that had not really been that loud on the original mixes. When you unpack a multi-track, sometimes it does show inconsistencies in the playing. So I was faced with a couple of quandaries. When you highlight a particular piece, if it then sounds a little bit out of time, I was able to move it a little bit and correct it. But also, a lot of the tracks were cut live, so sometimes there would be instrument spill on one thing that was causing a problem with another. In some cases I was able to use that spill to my advantage, and in other cases I had to get rid of that spill using some of the tools that are available to a producer today. In fact, some of the tools that we have today in record production really help this project. So my career started in 1975 as an engineer, and I had a great synchronicity with the sound of these records because they were cut, the majority of them were cut in the period that I was learning my craft. So there were certain things I could hear on the multi-track as an engineer with my engineer hat on that I recognized the process. I also recognized some of the frustrations that we had. So for example, for the younger people today used to laptops, some of the things that tape had were mechanical problems. Punching in and out was often incredibly complicated. And Even though Millie was a fantastic vocalist, you can obviously hear there's a couple of cases where there was a punch in, and I would obviously be able to fix that you couldn't have done before. Also sonically, what was so lovely about the mixing consoles in those days, and Millie got to work in some of the greatest studios in the entire world. When I looked at some of the track splits, for example, I see the name Muscle Shoals, Sigma Sound. These are the greatest recording studios on the planet. And the fact that these sessions were recorded there, as an engineer, it was fascinating, both to hear the original storytelling through the sound and also see how they often, in many cases, battled against the technology that they had. So I approached each remix on each track in its own form, because I was thinking this record would be more like a sort of snapshot, like a mini greatest hits. All the originals are still available, so if you love the originals, they're there, and I wasn't trying to compete with those. So I looked at each track, and in some cases it was because I loved the song so much I wanted to see what I could do with it. And in some cases, particularly some of the latter tracks where they were on 24 track, those give the producer more options. And it's fair to say on some of the earlier songs which were recorded on 8 track, my options were not that great. I had, the drums often are only on 1 track, and so separating instruments out can be done, but very often there's the bleed from the other instruments which prevents extending, and a lot of the tracks in those days, despite there being amazing musicians, they weren't done to a click. So editing, say, from the end to the beginning often wasn't possible because the tempo of the track had speeded up or slowed down a little bit. But it's certainly fair to say with some of the newer recordings from the repertoire, precision was becoming more of the part of record production, as it was for all of us. And so on some of the 24 track multi-tracks and some of the 16 track multi-tracks, I was able to extend, highlight and show certain things. One of the other things that may be very familiar to fans of Millie Jackson is how many of her records had segues between one track to the next. So in those days, though it was quite complicated to do crossfades with those many instruments. So in fact, what I found fascinating was that the crossfade sections were actually recorded on the multitrack. So song A would have a segue section recorded across the multiple tracks, ready to go into song B, whichever it was. So they had to plan their running order before they'd even finished the sessions, because they needed to record the little insert points. So this presented me with some interesting conundrums. Firstly, I needed to get out of the segue section and make the song finish on its own. So that meant that I have to listen to the segue section and think which bits were the sort of peak of the section and then move it back. And that worked particularly well. In one of the examples that I'm going to show later, If Loving You Is Wrong, I've managed to condense the segue section to almost give the track an ending that it never had. So that was fabulous. But often within those sections were some little bits of audio gold, little sections that I could use elsewhere to enhance. So that was fantastic. So every single track that I did, I looked at what was available on the individual tracks, how I had approached the mix, and what I could highlight that I think both the original fans of Millie would love, but a new audience would hear them in a new way. What to me as a record producer is fascinating about the way these tracks were originally recorded is they sound incredibly contemporary. They sound like the kind of records that there's a whole generation of soul artists are trying to emulate, and yet what we have here is the real deal, which is why particularly in some of the songs, I Cry for example, the extended version of that to me just sounds like one of those greatest records that Norman Whitfield never made. It sounds like a backing track that the Temptations would have given their eye teeth to sing on. So for me as a record producer, to hear those string lines and those parts isolated and then extended was fascinating, and I hope that's the journey that I can take the audience on when they listen to the CD. So I used to be an engineer. I started my career in 1975, and some of the first recording consoles I ever worked on were the Neve consoles of the day. Most of Millie's golden period was from that same era, and so I felt a sonic DNA attachment to it. I know the sound of those records and I know the sound of those mixing consoles. So when I was listening to some of the tracks in isolation, I'd listen to, say, the drum track, and I could really hear the sound of those EQ. And one of the things I've really tried to do on this remix is to be as historically correct as possible. So when I'm using modern day plugins, or indeed some of my vintage outboard, I've used historically correct items wherever possible. That's the engineering anorak in me, and for the love of the original work that the producers and engineers did on those original sessions. Am I more of a Millie fan now than I was before? I'd have to say absolutely yes, because I've begun to appreciate what an incredible vocalist she is in the studio. We all know that she's a great vocalist, but as a record producer, I can hear what was being done on those tracks. I can hear how she's approached the performance. And on some of the 24-track versions, there's actually 2 or 3 vocal takes, because the track count then was not so limiting, and so they were able to say do take 1, leave take 1, and then do take 2. So I was able to hear as a producer the journey that she was making on the final vocal performance, and I thought that was really, really fascinating. On one of the other tracks that appears on the record, the one that she did with Isaac Hayes, there's a whole run through where they were just working out what they were going to do. Again, as a record producer, that shows me the amount of focus that the pair of them were having on that track. One of the things that's really important to remember about this project is that all the multi-tracks have been transferred at super high resolution, 24-bit 96K for those that are technically minded, and that high resolution has been maintained throughout this project. It's stayed at that super high resolution, and even the final mixes are at that resolution. What that reveals to me as a producer is the quality of the recordings. The other thing that I think is worth remembering is that many of the engineers in the late 60s and early 70s had cut their teeth, as it were, on the first pass of recording, when multi-track recording had just started in the early 60s all the way through. So these engineers were at the top of their game. They really, really had to work very, very hard. So when you listen to the multi-track, the recording quality that they attained and then printed onto tape was quite exceptional. In fact, it's something I see a lot with some of the younger students that I have in my studio. They tend to leave so much to the mix. They don't record the elements in the same way that perhaps an older engineer would record. Why this is important? I strongly believe that if you record the sound as you want it on the multi-track, bearing in mind, even in those days, the majority of the vocals were overdubbed after the backing track was recorded. If you create a much closer sound to your vision, all the subsequent performances are better. And I've done many radio shows, the record producers, where I've been given multi-tracks from a whole range of artists, from the Beatles to Pink Floyd to many of the Motown records. And this is the one thing that comes through on many, many of these original multi-track recordings. How important it was to get the sound recorded correctly onto tape so the subsequent performances would be so much better. And this is absolutely true of Millie's multi-tracks. The engineering prowess that's on those recordings is exceptional. It's really something to be very, very proud of. And I'm certainly very proud to have been given the opportunity to just peer behind the curtain a little bit. One of the tracks that I'm very proud of on this record is I Cry, but it did give me a big, big headache on multiple reasons. It's been a firm favourite of mine since I first heard it when I was, 14 or 15. And for those that are familiar with the record, it starts with a bass guitar and a bass drum, and then it builds the track up. And it was only when I looked at the multi-track, and in fact when I looked at the track split, I realised what had gone on. They'd obviously wanted to add that intro to the rest of the track, but this was in the days before clicks, before hard disk editing. And I think it's fair to say that the front of that song leaves a little bit to be desired. But what was a bonus for me was that that bass drum at the front had actually been overdubbed to go with the bass. So that gave me a beautiful isolated kick drum sound, which I was then able to use subsequently in the rest of the song. Secondly, of course, with modern technology, I can see exactly where the bass player was playing and where the kick drum needed to be. So I did move a couple of them to get them bang on, and the difference was remarkable. But one of the things I was able to do on that multi-track is this was almost certainly cut before Dolby was available, or perhaps that studio didn't have Dolby available. It's quite interesting with the use of Dolby, because Dolby, for those that don't know, was a system that was designed to keep the tape hiss down on multi-tracks. And the studio versions of Dolby came through in the 70s. But some producers chose not to use it because it did have a small coloration of the sound, and depending on the type of track that you used, you didn't want to necessarily use it. Of course, famously in Spinal Tap, there's the quote, "You don't use Dolby on rock and roll." But the reality is, using a Dolby system did change the sound a little bit. But in my view as a producer, the benefits from the noise floor were substantial. And certainly when something had a very wide dynamic range, very quiet or very loud, at the very quiet pieces, sometimes the noise was quite loud. And in the case of I Cry, some of the background noise on that track, if you listen to the original CD, you can hear it, it's quite hissy. And I think, as a listener, takes away from the enjoyment of that record. And so I was able, with modern technology, to tidy that up. Again, I mentioned before about having outtakes. One of the other great things was, before that track started, there was about 10 seconds of nothing. And the 10 seconds of nothing was the sound of the tape hiss. So I was able to take the sound of the tape hiss, and we have modern technology now that will take a fingerprint of that tape hiss and just literally remove that from the rest of the recording without damaging the rest of the recording. So I was able, and I'm very pleased with the results, to get rid of that. On the same subject, there were a number of songs where, again, we have such great understanding of synthesizers today and how they need to be recorded. I remember myself as an engineer back then, somebody would bring in a Fender Rhodes electric piano or clavinet, and you just often just plug it straight into the desk. Unfortunately, that's not the best way of doing it. And so some of the clavinets particularly were going through pedals, and there was a lot of hum on them and noise. And American hum is 60 hertz as opposed to British hum, which is 50 hertz. And that's actually slightly more audible than 50 hertz. Again, using the same technology, I was able to strip out the mains hum and get rid of it. And again, it made the clavinet just brighter, punchier in the track, but it didn't get rid of any of the essence of the sound. It kept the loving care that they put into the sound, but I was able to get rid of the technical problems with it. So yes, I feel that in many cases I've been able to enhance the tracks using modern technology, and perhaps that will make the listening experience even more pleasurable. The decision on how far to extend really was down to the song. So for example, some of the songs are only extended a tiny little bit. It Hurts So Good, for example, is just a small extension. It's such a powerful song and a very well-known song. But on that song, for example, I was able to really enhance some of the drums that were not available on the original, because I was able to split the 8-track in a way that you can only do on the computer. So I think that was great. But then there are some where they are only a little bit longer than the original, and they are very much the original, but just maybe a, if you like, a sort of a higher fidelity version of the original. And in some cases I've stripped back some of the reverb that was used on the original, because it's interesting when you look at the younger generation of people that want to emulate the soul music of the 70s. The perception is it's much drier. Actually, when you listen to it, it isn't. But a lot of the current bands that are emulating this kind of 70s sound, it's very, very dry. So I thought, why don't I do a few like that? So some of them are a little drier than the originals, less reverb, less delay. But then on some of them, I've used delay intentionally. So for example, if on Loving You, I was taking a nod from things that go full circle. So many of Millie's songs have been re-recorded by reggae artists. It's often the case that so many great lovers rock records emulate the classic songs that were hits, and of course the sound of reggae has spring reverb and dub delay on it. So I've kind of gone full circle on some of those, where I've gone back to what the reggae versions did to pop it back on Millie's original version. Modern records do have more bass on them than older records, and that's down to a whole host of things. We're able to capture bass far more accurately now, and certainly if your experience of your classic records is only on vinyl, vinyl itself has less bass on it than a modern recording. But what I was able to do on many of Millie's recordings, and I'm so pleased that the bass end has turned out to be so lovely, is a combination of enhancement, and that's been, so let's take a bass drum for example. A modern drummer today will record his kit, it'll be multiple mic'd, and very often they'll have what's called a sub kick, and a sub kick gives you a low frequency. And this has come about because one of the byproducts of all the dance music is that a real natural drum kit doesn't have the low end that a dance drum kit comes, you know, like I've got many of them here, those classic rhythm boxes The most famous being, say, the TR-808, the Roland record. In the 80s, a lot of the records had the TR-808 on it, and that has a real low end on it. That is why it's so popular in the clubs. So many drummers over the last number of years have started incorporating some of these sounds in their own acoustic kits. And a sub-kick is an acoustic kit. It's essentially the reverse of a speaker. It captures only the low end of the bass drum. So what I was able to do was, because I have a recording studio here, I was able to take an original bass drum from Millie's record, feed it into my acoustic sub kick, and then re-record it back into the track. That gives me the natural low end from the original recording, but it gives an enhancement that was never there originally. In terms of the bass guitar, most had bass guitar on them, some had bass synth. In some cases, depending on the song and depending on the track count, the tracks were split between amplifier and DI. The majority were DI. But one of the tricks is this clever thing called phasing. Now, in many cases, phasing is a problem for recordings. If you have two things and they're out of phase, you will get cancellation, which results in a lower end. And there were one or two tracks where I noticed, and it's only with the ability of modern technology, that, for example, the overhead microphones were out of phase with the kick drum microphone, and reversing the phase on that suddenly brought a huge improvement. That was almost for no money. It was literally a technical issue where they'd had to combine multiple mics because the track count was low, and one of them might have been out of phase, and that was causing a small amount of cancellation. But by just fixing that technically in the computer, which is easy to do now, was more complicated to do then, and they didn't have the devices to analyze it. So it was really on, an ear shot. You go, okay, that sounds right. But in the modern studio, I'm able to analyze it forensically and go, no, that's actually out of phase, and I've got various plugins or boxes to fix that, and that made a huge difference. So that's not interfering with the original recording at all. It's just correcting a technical issue. So one of the things I made a conscious decision to do was to not interfere with the timing at all. It's fair to say with modern software, it's possible to time align things, and you can move things to the click and then you can overdub extra things. I didn't do that. Instead, what I decided to do was have it effectively wild, but look at where beats were. So for example, when I extended a section, what I would do is group all of those tracks together, and I would be editing in a multi-track style. I would look at my edit point and I'd move everything to match the edit point, and then fine tune, because we have the benefit of multi-track, fine tune it. So for example, if my edit point was on the beginning of a chorus and I happened to notice that the drummer had slightly missed the one, I could just in the file move it slightly to the left or the right just to accommodate that. So I didn't interfere with the timing at all. However, that did make some of it quite complicated in terms of extending some of the later tracks. So for example, in the Isaac Hayes track, I wanted to extend the conga break, but there was quite a lot of spill on that, which meant that every time I did an edit, you could hear where I edited it. So what I was able to do with that was analyze the timing of the congas and then make a duplicate of the congas from fresh samples, which then covered up the edit. So I haven't requantized anything. I have moved individual moments here, there and everywhere. There was a couple of tracks, for example, where I noticed there was a piano motif that I really liked, and I brought it to the fore, but I also noticed about the third or fourth time they played there was a mistake on it, which you would never have noticed originally, but I was able to then copy the correct version and edit the mistake out. So there's a few little things like that I was able to fix. But certainly if there were cases when I did editing where the timing went a bit floppy because of my edit, I could move things. But I definitely left the original timing and the original musician integrity as it was. It was trying to be as respectful as possible to the original performances without time correcting. Again, if I was doing a dance remix, you'd have to quantize everything because you'd want to fly some loops into it, and you'd have to have all the modern things that you would do. And in fact, so much so that even when I would do delays, if you've got a modern tempo mapped song, delays like that, I'd have to do my delays by hand. And in fact, on a couple of them, I actually did use my original analog tape delay, because that gives you that splodge in a way that's actually more respectful to the original, and then I just recorded that on a separate track. Of course, when you're rummaging around the multi-track, there's always bits that you fancy. There are, across her catalogue, there's a few unfinished songs. So if we ever get around to doing part 2, maybe I can explore those a little more. But there were a few bits that I wanted to work with, and they were a little bit frustrating because either I just couldn't isolate enough, and I wasn't going to be bringing any more to the party than the original. So there were a few that I tried to work on, and I maybe wasted a couple of days on it. I tried to extend it, and it just, when I listened back to it, I thought, no, this isn't quite right, and it's not as good as the original, or I'm not bringing anything extra to it. So I left those. And there were one or two where I had an idea to do some extended bits, but because the amount of spill on the tracks, it was impossible. In fact, there was one song, I can't remember which one it was, but there was actually a guide vocal that was cut with the backing track in the room, which you could hear slightly on the drum mics, which meant every time I did a cut you could hear that it was repeating, and it didn't work. So there, you know, maybe for another time, but there were a few elements that I could just, the technical limitation was such I couldn't overcome them. So my workflow was as follows. I'd look through the Excel spreadsheet and see which track I wanted to use, and then look at the reference numbers. Ace have done a fantastic job of cataloguing, so that everything has a number, and then you can kind of go through the Excel spreadsheet and find the piece you want. And then I would then copy those raw files into my system. Invariably they'd be really long, because a piece of multi-track, if it was recorded at 15 IPS, it would be about maybe 20 minutes long. If it was recorded at 30, which I think only a couple were, then it was 15 minutes. So there'd be a piece of audio that would be the 15 or 20 minutes approximately. That's a chunk of data. You could see very clearly from the waveform where each song started and ended, and then I'd look at the notes just to see from the track split, the original producer's notes. You know, often they'd have things like, oh, it was take 3, or there was a full start, or something like that. So I'd make a note of which was the master, and I'd highlight that with a particular colour, and then I'd either, depending on whether I wanted to, if you like, harvest something from the outtakes, I would harvest from the outtakes and then make a new master, and then I'd save that as a new Steve Levine version, and then I'd start working on that. So what have I learnt and taken away from this project? Well, certainly I have even more respect, if that's possible, for Millie as an artist. It's incredible to think that her career went from her as a teenager working on 8-track all the way through to 24-track MCI, multi-track and mixing console with Isaac Hayes, which is like, if you, and there's a lovely picture that shows Millie working with Isaac Hayes on an MCI desk with an MCI machine, which was pretty much state of the art towards the end of the 70s. That was really, in fact, all my Culture Club records were cut on MCI desks, MCI machines. That was, if you're in the music business, that was the thing to have. It was just, had the best automated mixing, the multi-track could punch in and out. But when you look at those multi-tracks versus when she first started, you could see how frustrating it must have been, because as lovely as 8-track was, and it was incredible for those that were using 8-track versus 3-track and 4-track only a few years before, it still had massive restrictions. So I love the fact that she was at the top of her game when she first started, but her whole career as an artist and as a producer matured and matured and matured. What's lovely is when you look across the track splits, you see the same people. She kept very, very loyal relationships with her musicians and her producers. It's the same people on multiple tracks across multiple years. That's really terrific, really, really terrific. I guess she must have had such a great relationship with the people she worked with, and who also understood what she wanted as an artist. When I listen to the isolated vocals, I realise again what a tremendous artist she is as a vocalist. She really, really is. Very powerful lyrics. I think that's the thing that she's been known for throughout her career. They don't mess around. She, I have to say, was probably one of the first, as far as I'm aware, female soul artists, and it's important to emphasize that, because I think in the rock world it wasn't the case, but in the soul world, a female soul artist that was in charge of her own career, was writing lyrics about the situation that many black women found themselves in the 70s. That was incredibly rare. I mean, if you look at the Motown catalogue, those songs don't cover those subjects. It's not until Motown matured into the late 70s that suddenly you had people like Marvin Gaye writing lyrics that were really about the situation in the world. Whereas Millie was writing about that multiple years before. I think that's a really powerful thing, which is why I think those songs stand up so well today just as songs. And I'm hoping with the enhanced remixing, it'll allow a whole new audience to go, wow, that's pretty impressive. And for those that are the fans of her catalogue, if you still love the originals, those are there. And they're there now in glorious reissued vinyl. But those that want maybe a peer behind the curtain or to hear some parts they never knew before, that's the thing. It's the same as when, for example, a director does a director's cut or a director's voiceover on a film. You see things and hear things in a way that you never realise when a director explains why they put the camera there or why that scene is in a certain way. And I'm hoping with this, by enhancing some of the brass and the strings and the lines, you go, those are fantastic parts. Those are not only really well written parts, but as is the case across all these years, phenomenally well played. If I could book a brass section like that today for a session, I'd be thrilled. They are such great players and really know their stuff. So that's the thing that's really affected me the most, that it was great to peer behind the curtain for me as a producer. Of course, a producer learns on every session, and there's things I learnt on here that I will take away for my next production. I mean, simple things like they didn't have all these millions of keyboards that you have today, so they had to make the most of what they had. So some of the tracks have very interesting uses of things like clavinet. Everyone's used to the sound of Stevie Wonder in his clavinet, and that's the sound it makes. That's the classic sound. And yet they've used it to play quite discrete lines, or they might double it with a piano, because that's what was available, and they had to think very, very interestingly about things. I learned a little bit like this from great producers like Lamont Dozier when I was looking at some of the Motown multi-tracks, and I'd ask him questions about some of the choices of colours that they used, and he would say, that's all we had. We only had a Hammond organ or an electric piano and a guitar. And some of the greatest songs on Motown have actually got interesting combinations of instruments that create the riff. You just take them apart and you go, it's just an organ and a guitar, but together they create something. And that's true of many of Millie's songs. There's great use of orchestration, really clever ideas, and I would definitely take that away as a producer.